A 2,000-year-old scroll from the Roman town of Herculaneum has been digitally unwrapped. The document was badly burnt by the volcanic eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD.
For more than 4,000 years, a deep mystery lay quietly hidden beneath the sands of Egypt until today. After days of careful excavation, scientists uncovered it. The descent was tight, steep, and dangerous, a narrow vertical passage leading into complete darkness. At the bottom sat a sealed chamber. What they found inside was even more shocking, something that still leaves everyone in awe at the intent behind its burial. Join us in this video to uncover the details surrounding what archaeologists found in an ancient Egyptian burial shaft that just changed human history. How they made the discovery. At first, everything seemed ordinary. Workers carefully cleared away layers of sand, while documenting broken stones and following notes left behind by earlier excavations. From the surface, there appeared to be nothing there. No doorway cut into the rock. No signs of a hidden burial chamber beneath the earth. According to field reports, the area looked completely empty, the kind of place archaeologists might pass over without a second thought. But then, something changed.
And so in that case, we're trying to just do original work to see what we can find. And in this case, to see if these higher caves actually held scrolls, as did the lower cave.
As the excavation continued, the team uncovered a small opening in the limestone. It did not resemble a traditional entrance. It was narrow, sharply cut, and dropped straight down into the bedrock. The deeper they cleared the debris, the clearer it became that they had found a vertical shaft. Careful measurements later revealed its true depth, nearly 60 feet straight down. There were no stairs, no sloping passageways, no side tunnels near the top. Reaching the bottom would not be easy. Before anyone could descend, the excavation team first had to stabilize the shaft walls to prevent collapse. Only then could they begin the dangerous journey into a chamber that had remained sealed for millennia. The team installed ropes and safety harnesses before anyone attempted the descent. One by one, archaeologists slowly lowered themselves into the shaft while equipment was sent down separately. The passage was so tight that there was barely enough room to move. Once inside, there was no space to turn around or even pause comfortably. Anyone going down had to fully commit, knowing the climb back up would be just as difficult and exhausting. Almost immediately, the depth of the shaft raised questions. Burials in this part of Egypt were not normally built this way. Even the tombs of powerful priests and high-ranking officials were usually connected to visible structures above ground. But this shaft felt different. According to archaeologists at the site, it seemed less like an entrance and more like a deliberate obstacle, something designed to keep people out. And the deeper they descended, the more that feeling grew. What troubled the team even more was the area surrounding the shaft. There were no nearby chapels, no tomb entrances, and no surface markings linking it to a burial complex. It sat isolated from the usual network of tombs spread across the necropolis. From above, there was absolutely nothing that would attract attention or encourage grave robbers to dig there. Locals familiar with the region had long considered that stretch of land empty and unimportant, not a sacred place where the dead were buried. As excavation continued, evidence of intentional concealment became impossible to ignore. The top of the shaft contained tightly packed layers of fill and carefully fitted stone. This was not the result of a natural collapse. According to excavation reports, the materials had been deliberately arranged, almost as if the people who sealed the shaft wanted to erase every trace of its existence. In a place like Saqqara, that detail was extraordinary. For centuries, tomb robbers had broken into countless burials across the region, stripping them of valuables and leaving destruction behind. But this shaft showed none of those signs. There were no broken seals, no scattered debris, and no marks from tools forcing entry. Nothing. That silence was deeply unsettling. Even the most experienced archaeologists became noticeably cautious as the excavation continued. Their pace slowed. Every movement became deliberate. By the time the shaft had been fully cleared, one thing was obvious to everyone involved. This burial had never been meant to be found. And when the team finally opened the chamber at the bottom, they realized the secrecy surrounding the burial was only the beginning. What did they find? How much truth was locked away in this tomb? Keep watching to find out. What archaeologists found. The chamber itself was small and completely sealed off. Archaeologists had to lower the lights carefully before they could fully see the space. It felt functional, almost deliberate in its simplicity, as though every object had been placed for a specific purpose rather than tradition. But something was lurking in the darkness. The sarcophagus. Once the tomb was fully uncovered, inscriptions identified the owner not as a king or royal figure, but as a high priest. That discovery immediately created tension among the excavation team. High priests were important and deeply respected in ancient Egypt, but their burials followed established customs. They were not usually hidden deep underground in isolated shafts. They were not given unusually complex construction or treated with extraordinary secrecy. Yet, this burial clearly was. According to field reports, the chamber went far beyond what someone of the priest's rank would normally receive. The difference was impossible to ignore, and it raised a troubling question. Why was this individual buried in a way that resembled concealment more than honor? The body itself only deepened the mystery. The mummy had been wrapped in multiple layers of linen, unlike anything typically seen from that period. The cloth carried unusual mineral pigments, creating faded yellow tones crossed with pale red streaks that formed uneven bands across the wrappings. Researchers collected samples immediately for laboratory testing. Preliminary reports suggested the material was not colored with ordinary dye. Instead, the linen appeared to contain finely ground minerals mixed directly into resin. Some researchers speculated that the mixture may have been designed to change over time, possibly to harden the wrappings or preserve specific environmental conditions inside the chamber itself. That theory has not been confirmed, but the possibility alone was enough to alarm the excavation team. There was gold inside the chamber, but its placement made almost no sense. In ancient Egyptian burials, gold was usually reserved for sacred symbols, royal masks, or areas connected to spiritual protection and rebirth. But here, the gold leaf appeared in thin strips and repeating shapes woven along the wrappings and around the edges of the sarcophagus. It did not look decorative. Egyptologists examining the patterns struggled to connect them to any known funerary symbols or artistic traditions. According to some scholars, the repeated shapes looked less like ornamentation and more like markers, boundaries carefully placed with intention and control. That interpretation changed everything. If the gold was not meant for beauty or ceremony, then it may have served an entirely different purpose. The walls of the chamber only deepened the mystery. There were no familiar carvings showing judgment in the afterlife, no images of gods, no processions carrying offerings. None of the sacred spells typically found inside Old Kingdom tombs appeared anywhere on the stone. Instead, faint lines stretched across the walls. At first glance, they seemed random and unfinished, but closer inspection revealed something far more deliberate, repeating angles, circles, and intersecting pathways arranged with remarkable precision. These were not artistic decorations. They looked measured, almost mathematical. The architecture of the tomb reinforced that unsettling impression. Archaeologists noted that the chamber's proportions did not match standard Old Kingdom designs. The widths of the passages, the spacing of the walls, even the height of the ceiling differed from other priestly burials discovered in the region. Some researchers began to suspect the dimensions were intentional. Rather than following religious tradition, the chamber may have been designed to create or preserve a specific internal condition. Then came the infrared scans. Imaging specialists discovered hidden markings buried beneath the surface of the stone itself. The symbols followed the same geometric patterns already seen throughout the chamber. More disturbing was the fact that these markings had been applied before the walls were fully finished, meaning they were never intended to be visible. Someone wanted them hidden, but why remained unclear. As more evidence emerged, the mood inside the excavation changed noticeably. According to reports from the site, conversations became quieter and more tense. Team members slowed their work, carefully reconsidering assumptions they had carried for years. Some feared they were misinterpreting the evidence. Instead, it felt like a place built for a purpose the excavation team could not fully understand. a purpose hidden beneath layers of stone, silence, and secrecy. But the most shocking discovery was not found on the walls or wrapped around the body. It was hidden beside the sarcophagus. What was hidden inside the sarcophagus? And what does it change about the history of the world? Let's see. The mystery of the sarcophagus and everything it changed. Once the chamber had been fully cleared, archaeologists shifted their attention away from the strange markings and toward an object resting near the sarcophagus. It was not placed on top of the coffin or buried beneath ceremonial offerings, as ancient texts usually were. Instead, it sat directly on the floor, close enough to reach by hand, yet deliberately separated from everything else in the chamber. According to excavation records, that placement immediately caught the team's attention. In ancient Egyptian burials, sacred writings were typically inscribed onto walls, carved into stone, or placed directly with the body itself. This was different. The scrolls appeared to have been given their own protected space. The bundle contained several papyrus scrolls tightly wrapped in layers of linen. The linen had been coated in hardened resin, sealing the package completely shut. Conservation specialists later explained that the resin acted almost like a protective barrier, shielding the contents from moisture, insects, and bacteria for thousands of years. Combined with the dry desert environment, the seal had preserved the scrolls in conditions that were nearly airtight. Realizing how fragile the discovery might be, the excavation team reportedly stopped work temporarily to stabilize the bundle before attempting to open it. Even brief exposure to air could have destroyed the ancient material. When researchers finally began their inspection, another surprise emerged. The papyrus sheets were unusually thick. Their fibers had been pressed densely together and layered with remarkable care, suggesting the material had been specially prepared rather than used for ordinary writing. Samples were quickly removed and sent for laboratory analysis under tightly controlled conditions. The results stunned the research team. Radiocarbon testing dated the scrolls to more than 4,300 years ago. That timeline placed them earlier than any complete papyrus text ever recovered from ancient Egypt. And suddenly, the discovery became far more significant than a hidden burial chamber. For decades, Egyptologists believed that papyrus documents from this early period rarely survived intact. Most known texts from the Old Kingdom existed only as fragments, damaged remnants, or later copies recreated centuries afterward. But these scrolls were different. They had survived almost completely preserved, sealed in darkness for over 4 millennia. What made the discovery even more extraordinary was the condition of the scrolls themselves. They were not broken fragments or damaged scraps, like most texts recovered from Egypt's Old Kingdom. These scrolls appeared almost completely intact. That alone challenged long-standing beliefs about how written records were produced and preserved during that period of Egyptian history. Some encounters become disturbing, not because of what is fully understood, but because uncertainty and unpredictability make every moment feel increasingly unstable. For years, historians assumed that full papyrus texts from this era rarely survived. Yet, here was evidence suggesting not only that advanced record-keeping existed much earlier than expected, but that certain texts had been deliberately created to endure for thousands of years. The ink revealed part of that story. Under microscopic examination, researchers discovered the writing was not made with simple carbon-based ink commonly used in ancient documents. Instead, it contained mineral pigments mixed with special binding agents designed to resist fading and deterioration over time. According to some researchers, this was not ordinary writing material. The ink appeared engineered for permanence. That detail suggested the creators never intended these texts to be temporary records or routine documents. Whoever made them expected them to survive. Even the papyrus itself raised difficult questions. Laboratory analysis revealed traces of plant fibers not native to Egypt's Nile Valley. Some researchers now believe the material may have originated from regions far to the south or east. possibly connected to ancient trade routes reaching into Nubia or the Levant. That theory is still being reviewed, but if confirmed, it would mean significant effort and resources went into producing these scrolls. They were not assembled from common local materials. Everything about them pointed to preparation, precision, and importance. The way the bundle had been sealed reinforced that impression. The linen wrappings were layered carefully and evenly, while the resin coating showed no signs of haste or excess. Conservation experts noted that the preservation method resembled techniques normally reserved for sacred ritual objects or items considered extremely valuable. The scrolls had not simply been stored, they had been protected. And perhaps the most striking detail of all was where they had been placed. Instead of being buried directly with the body, the scrolls rested beside the sarcophagus in their own separate space. That decision appeared intentional, and many researchers believe it carried symbolic meaning. Some scholars think the texts may have served as instructions, records, or knowledge meant to remain accessible within the chamber itself. Others argue the separation was deliberate, a way of distinguishing the knowledge from the person buried beside it. No one knows for certain, but one fact was impossible to ignore. The scrolls were treated with the same level of importance as the burial itself. They were isolated, preserved, and hidden away with extraordinary care, as though protecting the texts mattered just as much as protecting the dead. Why was the scroll buried the way they were? Keep watching to find out. Why the scrolls were hidden. At first, scholars believed the scrolls would fit neatly into what they already understood about ancient Egyptian texts. They assumed the writings were religious. That was the standard explanation. Egyptologists approached the scrolls using translation methods refined over decades of studying pyramid texts and coffin inscriptions. According to early reports, researchers expected to find familiar themes, prayers for protection, passages about rebirth, invocations to the gods, and symbolic guidance for the journey into the afterlife. And initially, some parts of the text seemed to support that theory. Certain words resembled known terms connected to transition and resurrection. A few passages mentioned stars, gates, and movement between realms. For a brief moment, scholars believed the discovery would simply expand existing knowledge of Old Kingdom religious language. The scrolls seemed important, but understandable. Then the patterns began to emerge. As translation continued, researchers noticed something strange. The text repeated itself with unusual precision. Entire phrases appeared multiple times with nearly identical structure. According to linguistic analysts, that level of consistency was highly unusual for ritual writing. Religious texts from ancient Egypt typically vary their language for rhythm, symbolism, and emphasis. These scrolls did not. The wording stayed rigid and exact, almost as though accuracy mattered more than style or ceremony. Then came the numbers. The scrolls contained repeated numerical sequences that did not match any known Egyptian religious system. They were not connected to sacred cycles, divine symbolism, or traditional numerology. Instead, the same values appeared again and again without alteration. At first, some researchers suspected errors in translation or damaged passages, but repeated reviews confirmed the numbers were intentional. That realization created serious problems for traditional interpretations. The references to stars complicated matters even further. Instead of describing symbolic constellations or mythological heavens, the text appeared to point to precise locations in the night sky. According to astronomical consultants studying the scrolls, some of the celestial references aligned with measurable star positions visible during specific seasons of the year. That level of accuracy was deeply unusual for symbolic religious literature. And then there were the diagrams. The symbols and geometric patterns embedded within the texts did not resemble decorative illustrations or ceremonial artwork. They appeared structured, measured, and technical, as if they were meant to communicate exact information rather than spiritual metaphor. By that point, confidence among researchers had begun to collapse. The scrolls no longer behaved like ordinary funerary texts, and the more scholars tried to force them into familiar explanations, the less those explanations seemed to work. Several sections of the scrolls included simple lines, circular shapes, and repeated geometric markings. But these were not illustrations in the traditional Egyptian sense. They did not depict gods, sacred animals, or scenes from mythology. The symbols looked functional, almost like diagrams meant to explain a process. At first, scholars tried to interpret them as abstract religious imagery. That explanation quickly fell apart. The more researchers compared the patterns to known Egyptian symbols, the less they matched anything previously discovered. The markings behaved less like spiritual artwork and more like technical notation. Then came an even more unsettling realization. The scrolls were missing the very things Egyptian religious texts almost always contained. There were no warnings about judgment in the afterlife, no discussions of purity or sin, no promises of reward, and no threats of punishment. The texts showed no concern for moral worthiness whatsoever. To many scholars, that absence was deeply disturbing. Ancient Egyptian beliefs about death revolved around judgment. The weighing of the heart, divine approval, and moral balance were central to nearly every funerary tradition. Yet these scrolls ignored all of it. It was as though the texts operated under an entirely different system. According to several researchers involved in the project, this discovery created growing tension among the team. Meetings became longer. Interpretations became less certain. Some scholars urged caution, warning against rushing to conclusions. Others argued that forcing traditional religious explanations onto unfamiliar material was distorting the evidence itself. Reports suggest translation work was paused multiple times as disagreements intensified behind the scenes. No one wanted to suggest that a major assumption in Egyptology might be wrong, but the deeper researchers went into the texts, the harder it became to ignore the contradictions. Every familiar explanation seemed to collapse under closer examination, and that uncertainty changed everything. Because once scholars stopped treating the scrolls as symbolic religious writings, the meaning of the texts shifted completely. What conclusions were arrived at? What was really in the scrolls? Let's see. The troubling details of the scroll. The moment researchers abandoned the assumption that the scrolls were prayers, the structure of the writing suddenly became clear. These were not hymns, they were instructions. According to translation notes, the text follows a rigid sequence. One step leads directly to the next. Conditions are established first, followed by expected outcomes. There are no emotional appeals, no praise directed toward gods, and no requests for divine intervention. The writing assumes something very different. If the instructions are followed correctly, the result will happen. That idea alone separated the scrolls from nearly every known funerary text of the Old Kingdom. The language reads less like worship and more like procedure. And according to researchers, the scrolls begin with a single overriding principle: control. The scrolls link key stages to the rising of Sirius, but not in a symbolic or mythic sense. According to astronomical consultants, the references match a very specific viewing window. This suggests the procedure was meant to be carried out at an exact moment in time, not during any general seasonal or ritual period. Everything depends on precision. Even the writing system reinforces that structure. The text alternates between red and black ink, and this distinction appears consistent throughout the scrolls. According to some scholars, black ink is used for describing actions, while red ink appears at points where something must be performed or spoken. This interpretation is still being debated, but the pattern is difficult to ignore. Taken together, the scrolls read less like religious literature and more like a step-by-step protocol. They outline what must be prepared, what must be controlled, what materials are required, and when each action should take place. The objective is not devotion, it is outcome. But just as the sequence begins to feel complete, it breaks. There is a gap, and evidence now suggests that a final section may be missing. At first glance, the bundle of scrolls appeared intact, but that certainty did not survive closer inspection. Conservators carefully examined the linen wrapping and measured the spacing of each layer. According to conservation reports, they identified a clear gap, a space where another roll should have been. What made this even more unusual was the condition of the seal. The resin around that empty space did not show the uniform cracking expected from age. Instead, it appeared disrupted, as though something had been removed after the sealing process was complete. When researchers turned their attention to the papyrus edges, the evidence became harder to dismiss. Several sheets ended abruptly, with torn fibers all aligned in the same direction. It looked less like gradual decay and more like a roll that had been pulled out quickly, without being carefully unwrapped. This was not the slow breakdown of time. According to some conservation specialists, the damage pattern suggests deliberate separation, done while the material still had enough flexibility to tear rather than crumble. And that changes everything. Because if the scrolls were originally part of a complete sequence, then what remains is only an unfinished system, a set of instructions without its final step, and a knowledge structure that was never meant to be understood halfway. That detail matters because it points toward intent, not accident. The surviving text repeatedly hints at a final stage that is no longer present. In several sections, the language shifts as if approaching completion. Words associated with illumination and joining begin to appear, suggesting an outcome is near. But each time, the sequence stops abruptly before that outcome is ever explained. Scholars searched through pyramid texts, coffin texts, and later guides for the dead, looking for parallels. According to Egyptologists involved in the review, the closest matches are only faint echoes, partial similarities, not full procedural sequences. If a final stage did exist, it may have belonged to a highly restricted tradition that was rarely. Why the tomb? Why do Egyptian people revere tombs so much? Keep watching to find out. The ancient Egyptian tomb culture. The ancient Egyptians spent many years building and preparing tombs, which they called houses of eternity. These tombs were far more than burial places. They were carefully designed spiritual spaces meant to protect the dead forever. During construction, master builders and supervisors carried out special rituals, and strict guidelines explained where tombs should be built, how they should look, and what materials should be used. Every tomb contained two important parts that reflected its religious purpose: a burial chamber and a mortuary chapel. The burial chamber was built underground and served as the resting place for the body and spirit of the deceased. Above ground was the mortuary chapel, where family members and visitors could bring food, drink, and offerings while performing rituals for the dead. Inside these chapels were false doors, which symbolized a connection between the living and the dead. Egyptians believed the spirit could pass through these doors, moving between the tomb and the chapel to receive offerings from the living. Egyptian tombs varied greatly in size and design. Some were pyramids, others were mastabas or rock-cut chambers carved into cliffs. These differences usually depended on the owner's wealth, social status, political conditions, or changing religious beliefs over time. Another important feature was the funerary cone. These small terracotta cones were inscribed with the owner's name and placed above the tomb entrance. Their pointed shape made it easy to press them into wet plaster. Funerary cones first appeared during the Middle Kingdom, but became especially common in private tombs around Thebes during the New Kingdom. The burial chambers themselves were like hidden galleries, never intended for ordinary human eyes. Their walls were filled with extraordinary paintings, carvings, and inscriptions created mainly for the gods. Egyptians believed art had sacred power. It could connect the mortal world with the immortal one and help free the dead from the stillness of death. To the Egyptians, tomb art was both magical and protective. It helped defend against chaos and evil forces that threatened the balance of the universe. Whether produced in workshops or specially commissioned, paintings, sculptures, carvings, and written texts were believed to call upon the gods to protect the tomb owner, guide them safely into the afterlife, and provide eternal nourishment forever. Egyptian culture has one of the longest recorded histories in the world, stretching back more than 5,000 years. Ancient Egypt was one of the earliest and most powerful civilizations, known for its highly organized society, strong traditions, and lasting influence on later cultures across Europe, Africa, and the Near East. Even after the age of the pharaohs ended, Egyptian society continued to evolve under Greek, Roman, and Arab influence. Today, modern Egyptian culture still carries traces of its ancient roots alongside elements shaped by Western culture and globalization. One of the most remarkable features of Egyptian culture is its continuity. Despite centuries of conquest, political change, and religious transformation, many ancient beliefs, customs, and daily practices survived in different forms. In rural Egypt especially, traditions passed down through generations still reflect customs that began thousands of years ago. Examples of this continuity can be seen in funeral practices, symbolic expressions of grief, and even everyday activities such as bread making, brewing traditional drinks like bouza, and preserving food using methods that date back to ancient times. Scenes from modern Egyptian life often resemble images painted on pharaonic tomb walls, showing similarities in family life, food preparation, and mourning rituals. The Egyptian dialect also preserves part of this historical connection. Many words and grammatical features from the ancient Egyptian language survived through Coptic before blending into modern Arabic, allowing fragments of the ancient language to remain alive today. Religious change in Egypt did not completely erase older cultural traditions. Instead, many ancient beliefs were adapted into newer religious systems. For example, Isis, the ancient goddess associated with motherhood, protection, and sacrifice, came to resemble figures such as the Virgin Mary or Sayyida Zainab in later religious traditions. Funeral customs from ancient Egypt also continued beneath Christian and Islamic practices, even when their meanings changed over time. Even acts that appeared destructive toward ancient Egyptian culture sometimes reflected older cultural ideas. During periods of early Christian iconoclasm, statues were often damaged by removing their eyes or noses. This was not random destruction, but followed the ancient belief that damaging these features could kill the spirit or power within the image. Throughout Egypt's history, foreign rulers repeatedly encountered a culture that adapted to change without completely losing its identity. Although some political and religious movements later attempted to distance Egypt from its ancient past. This could be seen in architectural styles during the Mamluk era and again during the Nahda. What do you think about the ancient scrolls and what their information changes for human history? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. Thank you for joining us. Look through this important archaeological find. We hope you found this video both thrilling and interesting. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Click the next video on your screen to catch up on the next shocking discovery. See you there.